Karen stood in the middle of the road holding a glittery baton in one hand and a half-empty wine glass in the other as a National Guard convoy of armored Humvees slowly approached like a wall of steel. With a bounce house behind her, a DJ blasting 90s pop, and a barbecue smoker puffing ribs into the wind, she refused to move. Cameras were rolling, kids were screaming with excitement, and one neighbor could be heard whispering, "Is she really trying to block the United States military with a party tent?" The lead vehicle idled in front of her. The driver leaned out and said, "Ma'am, this is a federally sanctioned route." Karen sipped her wine and snapped back, "Not today, soldier. This is the HOA's annual summer gala, and you can take your tanks around." 10 seconds later, a Black Hawk helicopter swooped overhead. And just like that, Karen's backyard bash turned into a national incident. It had started as a normal Saturday morning in Westbriar, a quiet, cookie-cutter suburban community known for its manicured lawns and painfully strict homeowners association rules. That particular morning, residents were preparing for a relaxing weekend when the calm was broken by Karen, the HOA president, marching down the main road in heels and a rhinestone sash that read Gala Queen. She barked orders at a group of teenage volunteers, instructing them to unload folding chairs and balloon arches from the back of a rental truck. Without notifying the city, the HOA, or any of her fellow board members, Karen had unilaterally decided to host a neighborhood-wide gala. And to make sure nobody missed it, she blocked off the only entrance and exit road into the community with plastic barricades, cones, decorative archways, and an inflatable unicorn. Karen had a long and infamous history in Westbriar. She had once fined a family for using the wrong shade of white on their window trim. She had organized a petition to ban wind chimes because they sounded too whimsical. And now she was throwing a road-closing party that nobody asked for and very few actually wanted to attend. But when Karen said mandatory attendance, she meant it. Flyers had been shoved under every door with the phrase "community participation is not optional" scrawled in red ink. Vendors had been called. A band was paid in cash. And the road was hers, whether the residents liked it or not. The problem was, Karen hadn't checked the date with anyone. Not with the city, not with emergency services, and definitely not with the nearby military base. Because at precisely 2 p.m., the Westbriar Main Road had been scheduled for a highly coordinated convoy drill for the National Guard. A convoy carrying communication equipment, prototype fuel units, and medical transport rigs. The route had been on the books for 6 weeks. Permits had been filed. Local authorities were aware. But apparently, nobody had accounted for a woman in a pink pantsuit deciding to turn a federally approved path into a hot dog stand strip. Captain Emilio Torres was the officer in charge of the convoy. Disciplined, calm, and not easily rattled, he had led transport drills through tight city streets and unpredictable flood zones. But he had never encountered a flamingo-themed detour guarded by a woman screaming, "This is sacred HOA ground." As the convoy approached the blockade, radios began crackling across all vehicles. The lead driver, Specialist Harris, slowed down and relayed what he saw. "Sir, road is blocked by civilians. I repeat, there's a neighborhood event occupying the entire roadway." A few seconds of silence followed before Captain Torres responded, "Proceed to halt, do not engage. I'll handle this personally." Karen was in full form. Wearing oversized sunglasses, she twirled her glitter baton in front of the stopped convoy as though she were leading a parade. When Torres approached her calmly and asked her to move the party to the adjacent lawn area, she threw back her head and laughed. "This is our private road, darling. You need a permit to drive a clown car here, let alone one of those gas-guzzling beasts." Torres explained that this was a designated emergency convoy route with legal clearance from the city and state. Karen simply crossed her arms, turned to the crowd of HOA loyalists munching corn on the cob, and shouted, "They want to ruin our celebration. Should we let them?" The crowd cheered awkwardly, unsure of what was actually happening. Across the neighborhood, residents began to peek through blinds and check their phones. Notifications about delayed deliveries and road closures had started rolling in. Parents trying to leave for kids' soccer games were now trapped. Elderly residents with scheduled medical appointments were stuck. One neighbor, Mr. Patel, tried to reason with Karen, explaining his wife had dialysis in 40 minutes. Karen rolled her eyes and suggested he helicopter her out if it was that urgent. Coincidentally, that helicopter did arrive, but not for Mrs. Patel. Hovering above was a National Guard chopper, circling the area in response to the delayed convoy. That's when things escalated. Radios switched frequencies. Officers on the ground were told to stand by. And inside the governor's office, a red folder was opened showing that one of the vehicles in the convoy contained experimental renewable fuel units on a time test. Every minute they were delayed could jeopardize the equipment, the data, and the mission. The situation was now classified as a federal interference case. Back at the scene, Karen was still sipping Chardonnay. She posed in front of the military vehicles for selfies, claiming on social media that the army had shown up to honor her leadership. She posted hashtags like Convoy Queen and Red White Wine. Neighbors were mortified. Kids were confused. The DJ was still playing music. But Captain Torres had had enough. He radioed for legal and city support while preparing to file a formal obstruction report. The police arrived shortly after but stood awkwardly between the barbecue grill and a cotton candy machine. Karen waved at them cheerily and said, "Boys in blue. Glad you could make it. Grab a plate." The officers tried explaining that she was in violation of multiple ordinances, but Karen insisted she had diplomatic immunity as the HOA president. One officer whispered to his partner, "I need a transfer." Another muttered, "This is going to be on the news." And it was. Within the hour, multiple clips of Karen standing defiantly in front of military vehicles went viral. One video, zoomed in from a neighbor's upstairs window, caught her shouting, "I hereby declare this neighborhood a non-federal zone." By the time dusk approached, the story had hit national networks. Anchors used phrases like suburban standoff and wine versus war wagons. Karen had become the face of one of the most absurd conflicts of the year, and she was still smiling, unaware that her biggest surprise was just minutes away. Because now, the governor was on the phone. And he wasn't calling to RSVP. He was calling to end it. Captain Torres stood quietly beside the lead Humvee, listening intently through his earpiece as the governor's directives came down. His face remained still, calm, professional, but his knuckles tightened slightly as he gripped the edge of the convoy map. The orders were clear. The situation had officially been escalated to a federal obstruction case, and Torres now had the authority to clear the route with full backing from the state. It wasn't just about the convoy anymore. Sensitive equipment in transit was entering its critical phase. Any further delay risked compromising national infrastructure testing. What Karen had turned into a carnival was now being documented for potential criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, Karen was completely oblivious. She had taken over the DJ's microphone and was loudly narrating what she believed to be a community triumph. She rambled about protecting the sacred peace of suburbia and how the HOA charter predated the state's transportation permit. The bounce house behind her had started to deflate, slumping in on itself like a visual metaphor for her delusions. A group of concerned residents gathered nearby, whispering among themselves. Some were openly panicking about not being able to leave the neighborhood. Others had started filming everything in hopes it would help them later in court. One mother had tears in her eyes as she explained her kid's asthma medication was stuck with the delayed courier outside the barricade. Despite all the chaos, Karen kept her posture elegant, adjusting her plastic tiara whenever the breeze pushed it crooked. She blew kisses to a drone hovering above, mistaking it for a news camera when in fact it was part of the convoy's surveillance unit. That footage was being relayed directly to the governor's staff and the federal legal team now on standby. With every second, the mountain of evidence was growing. Karen didn't know it, but her antics had gone from laughable to legally damning. Inside a dark SUV parked on a nearby hill, A federal agent in plain clothes was already reviewing the footage. His job was to determine whether charges would remain local or be pursued at the federal level. He watched Karen make a toast with pink lemonade and shout at soldiers to go play war somewhere else. He watched her repeatedly use the phrase civilian supremacy as if it meant something. He paused the video and scribbled a note. Confirmed obstruction, reckless endangerment, probable cause for interference with federal logistics. Back on the ground, Torres was done playing nice. He walked back to his convoy and gave his team a low directive to begin prepping for controlled clearance. It didn't mean they would barrel through like a tank division, but it did mean barricades would be moved, bounce houses deflated, and any person resisting would be documented and escorted aside. That's when a deputy sheriff, who had just arrived from another district, pulled Torres aside. He informed him that Karen had sent out emails earlier that morning claiming she had full legal ownership of the main road through a supposed deed update, one that turned out to be a forged PDF copied from a real estate website template. In Karen's backyard, a group of HOA members sat together in lawn chairs, nervously watching the standoff escalate. None of them wanted to be there anymore. One elderly couple whispered about whether they could just walk away without being associated with Karen's decisions. A younger man, formerly the HOA treasurer, quietly pulled out his phone and began drafting his resignation email. It was addressed to the entire neighborhood and ended with the line, "I no longer wish to be complicit in the madness of this administration." Still, Karen continued. She pulled out a makeshift podium, a white folding table with a lace cloth, and began speaking to her dwindling audience as if she were addressing the United Nations. She described the convoy as an invasion of peace, claimed she had pre-approved the road for parade use, and even compared herself to a founding mother defending the Constitution. A nearby child asked his father why the angry lady thought she owned the road. The father replied, "She doesn't, buddy. She just thinks yelling loud enough makes her right." Finally, the police tried one last time. Officer Rubin, a calm middle-aged man who had dealt with unruly HOA leaders before, approached her gently and explained the law. He showed her the permits, the planned route, the time-stamped correspondence from the city and state. He emphasized that people were trapped in the neighborhood, that critical medical needs were being ignored, and that obstructing a federal convoy was a crime. Karen squinted at the papers, then dramatically ripped them up and dropped the pieces into a decorative fountain. She said she didn't acknowledge documents that weren't notarized by the HOA board. That moment was also caught on camera, uploaded in real time by a teen with fast internet and a sense of irony. The video was titled Karen vs. the National Guard, Live Constitutional Crisis. The convoy team moved into position. Members of the logistics crew began to carefully dismantle the barricades and redirect foot traffic. Several attendees tried to sneak away, some pretending to tie their shoes and then power-walking toward their homes. Karen yelled after them, accusing them of cowardice. But it was too late. The wine buzz had faded. Her crowd was disappearing. Her board had gone quiet. And even her speakers were starting to crackle. The power from her rented generator had sputtered out. A military truck slowly inched forward as the inflatable unicorn was rolled to the side. Karen screamed that they were crushing sacred community symbols. Captain Torres watched with an expressionless face as Karen darted toward the grill, tried to push it in front of the vehicle, and was gently stopped by an officer who informed her she was now officially being detained. She demanded to speak to the President of the United States. The officer calmly replied that the governor had already signed off on her removal. As she was escorted to the curb, neighbors came out of their homes, not to stop it, not to protest, but to watch. The same people Karen had bullied for years were now standing silently, watching as her delusions collided with the real world. One man clapped once. Another brought out a lawn chair and a soda. Nobody intervened. The convoy moved. The vehicles glided past the homes, drivers focused, engines humming. For the first time that day, the road was doing what it was built for. The lead vehicle passed under the deflated archway, dragging a piece of bunting tangled in its side mirror. Nobody stopped it. Nobody dared. Karen sat on the curb, muttering about betrayal. She told an officer she had done this for the good of the neighborhood. He didn't respond. He didn't have to, because from that point on, her words didn't matter. Her roadblock was gone. Her power had collapsed, and what came next would make her regret ever placing that first cone in the street. News traveled faster than ever in the age of smartphones, and by the time the National Guard convoy had finished passing through Westbriar's once charmed Main Street, videos of Karen's chaotic standoff had reached millions. Clips of her shouting at armored vehicles, dramatically tearing up permits, and attempting to block a Humvee with a barbecue grill were spreading like wildfire. The hashtags started trending by nightfall: hashtag HOA Karen, hashtag Convoy Crisis, and the especially popular hashtag Unicorn vs. Military. National news outlets picked up the story, with commentators struggling to describe what they were seeing without bursting into laughter or disbelief. The footage was surreal. A woman with a rhinestone tiara, holding a wine glass and yelling about civilian supremacy, standing in the middle of a federally sanctioned military rout. The term delusional dictatorship trended briefly before being overtaken by memes of Karen trying to block tanks with lawn decor. In the governor's office, the situation was no longer a local embarrassment, it was now a state-level headache. The governor, a composed man with a military background himself, was furious. His chief of staff had shown him one of the videos on a tablet, and within seconds, he was calling his legal advisors. The convoy had been transporting experimental fuel cells that were sensitive to time and motion exposure. The delay, though ultimately brief, had pushed their tolerance thresholds. The state's partnership with the Federal Energy Agency was now under scrutiny, and the liability questions were mounting. He demanded an immediate breakdown of what authority this woman thought she had to override military movement, and was promptly shown the fake permit Karen had concocted using clip art and a Word document template. The governor didn't laugh. He ordered a full legal review and a press briefing scheduled for the following morning. Back in Westbriar, the HOA board was melting down. With Karen temporarily detained and released pending investigation, the remaining board members scrambled to distance themselves from her actions. A group chat originally titled HOA Leadership Corps was renamed Emergency Response Committee in an effort to rebrand overnight. Vice President Martha, who had once proudly worn matching cardigans with Karen, now claimed she had no prior knowledge of the road closure and was only present at the event because she thought it was a garden tour. Treasurer Kyle submitted a formal letter of resignation and a second email clarifying that he had only been handling snack logistics, not policy enforcement. Residents began digging up every strange or authoritarian HOA rule Karen had pushed through in recent months, and it became clear that her behavior had been growing more erratic. She had fined a resident for hanging wind chimes before 8 a.m., banned bird feeders for influencing migratory behavior, and once tried to remove a neighbor's backyard vegetable garden for not being HOA-approved foliage. The community was beginning to realize they hadn't just had a bad party, they had been under soft dictatorship. Karen, meanwhile, refused to take any accountability. Upon being released from detainment, she returned to her house with what could only be described as dramatic flair. She strutted up her walkway with sunglasses on despite it being night, and when approached by a small crowd of reporters, she made a vague statement about being targeted by a corrupt military-industrial complex that feared her leadership. She called the convoy an intimidation tactic, and said she was the victim of a government overreach designed to silence community voices. That night, she held an emergency press conference from her porch using a ring light and her smartphone. During the livestream, she claimed the road actually belonged to the HOA through a mysterious land deed that nobody had ever seen, then pivoted into ranting about constitutional zones and referencing obscure and unrelated legal cases. The livestream was flooded with comments ranging from hilarious to horrified. At one point, Karen declared herself a provisional road commissioner and promised to fight the injustice with every HOA dollar available. That was the last straw. Residents flooded the HOA's email inbox with demands for her immediate removal. The emergency meeting that followed was like something out of a courtroom drama. Held in the clubhouse, the meeting was packed with furious neighbors, exhausted board members, and several off-duty officers posted outside just in case Karen tried anything erratic. For the first 20 minutes, nobody could hear a thing due to the sheer volume of arguments and demands for resignations. When the floor was finally opened for public comment, person after person took the mic to detail how Karen's behavior had caused embarrassment, fear, or direct harm. A nurse explained how she missed a hospital shift due to being blocked in. An elderly couple recounted how they were trapped inside during extreme heat, with no way to retrieve their medication. A teenage boy spoke up about how embarrassed he felt knowing his friends from another school saw the viral clip of his neighborhood being held hostage by a pink inflatable flamingo. Then came the surprise. During the chaotic meeting, a calm voice asked for the mic. It was a woman who had rarely spoken at meetings, someone most neighbors recognized only in passing. She introduced herself as Mariana Torres, wife of Captain Emilio Torres. Gasps spread through the room. She explained how she had lived quietly in Westbriar for 3 years, enjoying the peace but never feeling welcome under Karen's leadership. She detailed the rules that restricted flags, flowers, or any personal expression. She described the growing pressure many residents felt, too afraid to speak out. And then she calmly stated that she would be filing a formal complaint against Karen for obstruction, forging HOA documents, and violating community bylaws. When asked by one resident if she had legal standing, Mariana smiled and explained that she was not only the wife of the convoy leader, but also a practicing attorney who specialized in municipal law. The clubhouse erupted in applause. Karen, watching the live feed of the meeting from her home, was livid. She began posting angry rebuttals to the community forum, accusing Mariana of being a plant from the government. She alleged that the convoy was never real, that it was all staged to discredit her. She uploaded shaky cell phone footage of the convoy as evidence of her claims, unaware that it only confirmed her obstruction. Her final post of the evening read, "You may take my tiara, but you'll never take my HOA." 30 minutes later, the HOA board voted unanimously to suspend her pending a full legal review. The next morning, national news stations aired a segment titled From Block Party to Blockade. Karen's story had reached mainstream attention. Editorials poured in. Legal experts explained the layers of violations she had committed. Military analysts noted the risk she had posed to sensitive equipment. Even comedians jumped in, with late-night hosts joking that HOA presidents now needed background check. Karen, still convinced she was the hero of a suburban revolution, issued one last declaration on her social media before going silent. She said she would be launching her own independent HOA called the Karen Republic, a place where no one could tell her when to park, where to walk, or how to party. But back in Westbriar, things were changing fast. The HOA was now under internal audit. New elections were announced. Captain Torres issued a public statement thanking the residents for their patience during the convoy delay. His words were brief but sincere. He said he never expected to encounter an inflatable unicorn on a military drill, but he appreciated the resilience of the community that handled it with grace. The convoy had passed. The dust was settling. But nobody in Westbriar would forget the day when their HOA president tried to declare war on the National Guard. As the sun rose the next morning over Westbriar, the neighborhood wore a strange silence, as if it were still holding its breath from the absurd chaos of the day before. The bounce house was gone, deflated and dragged into a dumpster by a maintenance worker who had refused to speak on camera. The charred remains of Karen's barbecue grill sat on the side of the street like some bizarre monument to delusion. Balloons hung limply from tree branches, and the inflatable unicorn was crumpled against a lamppost, half deflated and dirty. What had started as a party meant to showcase HOA prestige had ended in national embarrassment, federal involvement, and the total collapse of Karen's power. Inside her house, Karen paced the floor in her silk robe, phone in hand, muttering as she scrolled through hundreds of messages. Some were from supporters, mostly out-of-town followers who cheered her stand against what they called government overreach. But most were not. The HOA email was flooded with formal complaints. The local news had run 3 segments about the incident, each more damning than the last. Her image was plastered on tabloids and memes alike. The one of her mid-scream, holding her wine glass while a military Humvee loomed behind her, was already printed on T-shirts. Her attempt to stop a federal convoy had turned into a national punchline. Despite everything, Karen wasn't finished. In her mind, the story hadn't ended in defeat. It had just entered a new phase, one where she'd rise from the ashes like a suburban phoenix, vindicated by some miracle of public support. She began drafting a statement for a so-called redemption livestream, but her plans were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was met by 2 federal officers in plain clothes. They politely informed her that she was being served with a court summons. Karen blinked in disbelief. She tried to argue, saying she was the wronged party. But the officers didn't need to explain. The documents were self-explanatory: multiple charges including obstruction of a federal operation, unlawful detainment of emergency transport, and reckless endangerment. While Karen was left standing on her porch with legal papers fluttering in her trembling hands, across the neighborhood, something entirely different was unfolding. Mariana Torres, the quiet resident who had shocked everyone at the emergency HOA meeting, was being celebrated as a hero. She had quickly become a symbol of sanity and resilience. A group of neighbors organized a small appreciation event at the community clubhouse, and to everyone's surprise, Mariana actually attended. People approached her with questions, stories, and ideas for reforming the HOA. She listened carefully, offered practical advice, and by the end of the evening, residents had begun circulating a petition to nominate her for the newly opened position of HOA president. Captain Torres stood at the back of the clubhouse, arms crossed, observing with quiet pride. He hadn't said much since the incident but had been working closely with both the military's legal team and local officials to ensure every action taken during the convoy delay was documented properly. In private, he told Mariana he hoped Westbriar could move forward without paranoia, barricades, or inflatable distractions. She agreed, but also knew that Karen wasn't done just yet. Not while she still had access to the HOA member database. Sure enough, Karen fired back later that night with an email blast titled, "A Message from Your Real President." In it, she claimed that the charges were politically motivated, the convoy was a psyop, and the community was being led by infiltrators. She promised to fight the legal system with the full might of the HOA fund, even though the board had already frozen the account. The message was long, rambling, and ended with an offer to sell merchandise for legal defense donations. Most residents didn't even finish reading it. A few replied with screenshots of memes. Others simply blocked her email address. The next day, law enforcement officers returned to Westbriar, not to arrest Karen, but to retrieve HOA records as part of an active investigation. Under a court order, the HOA's documentation was now subject to a forensic audit. Officers collected meeting minutes, email logs, financial reports, and all past incident complaints. It quickly became clear that Karen had a long history of abusing her position. She had personally issued hundreds of dollars in unapproved fines, altered voting records during HOA elections, and even used association funds to rent the party equipment for her ill-fated gala. Her claims that the convoy had ruined her event were laughable in light of the evidence that she had never filed for a permit, never informed the HOA board, and had acted completely alone. That evening, Mariana received a phone call from the state attorney's office. They informed her that based on her legal expertise and her role in assisting during the emergency meeting, they were appointing her as an official community liaison during the investigation. She was stunned. She hadn't expected to become involved in anything beyond helping her neighbors get their HOA back. But now she was part of the wider effort to prevent future abuses like Karen's. It was strange how something so absurd could have such serious consequences, but Mariana was ready to help however she could. Karen, on the other hand, was spiraling. With mounting legal pressure and no official standing in the HOA, she resorted to theatrics. She set up a folding chair on the community sidewalk and declared it the new office of the People's HOA. She live-streamed herself reading from the HOA charter as if it were a sacred text and attempted to swear in a teenage dog walker as her new secretary. Most residents ignored her. A few watched from a distance out of curiosity. Eventually, it started raining and Karen, soaked and shivering, packed up and stormed back inside, vowing revenge against what she now referred to as the HOA coup. By the weekend, the new HOA election had been scheduled. Flyers were placed in mailboxes. The board now operated under interim leadership, with Mariana acting as a neutral advisor. Residents who had never participated before were stepping up, offering to take over landscaping rules, safety patrol, and even the newsletter. For the first time in years, there was a sense of community in Westbriar that didn't revolve around fear of fines or surveillance. Kids played outside again. Neighbors chatted on porches. And a large banner was hung at the community entrance reading, "Welcome to Westbriar. No roadblocks, no dictators, just neighbors." Karen watched all of this from behind her curtains. Her attempts to rebuild support had failed. Her emails went unanswered. Her so-called support team was down to 2 distant cousins who had stopped responding after the convoy footage aired on national TV. She filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination from the HOA, but it was dismissed the following week. Her only remaining hope was a Hail Mary plan, appealing to the national media once more. She booked an interview on a fringe podcast known for conspiracy theories. She ranted about black helicopters, deep state HOA infiltration, and electromagnetic manipulation of her sprinkler system. It was so unhinged that even the host struggled to stay composed. The episode was flagged and removed within hours. As the community election approached, turnout was higher than ever before. People who had never cared about HOA politics now realized how quickly power could be abused. Mariana didn't campaign, but her name was on every ballot. When the votes were tallied, she won by a landslide. During her acceptance speech, she thanked the community for coming together and reminded them that it wasn't just about removing a tyrant, it was about building something better. The crowd cheered. Some even cried. Karen didn't show up to the election. She stayed home, curtains drawn, pretending she had something more important to do. But deep down, she knew. Her reign was over, and the road she once claimed as her kingdom had become a symbol of everything she had lost. On the morning following the election, Westbriar woke up to something it hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Not just the kind of quiet that comes from trimmed hedges and cars parked perfectly within the lines, but a real, collective sigh of relief. It had taken a federal convoy, national ridicule, and the implosion of an HOA presidency to get there, but for the first time in years, residents felt like they lived in a community, not a kingdom. Children rode bikes along the street without being chased down for helmet colors, senior citizens walked their dogs without getting warnings about leash length, and best of all, no one was getting fined for invisible offenses like unharmonious window tint or wind chimes too cheerful in tone. Mariana Torres officially stepped into her new role with calm grace. She didn't come in swinging or promising sweeping revenge on those who had aligned with Karen. Instead, she opened the first meeting with a message about rebuilding trust. She proposed that every rule in the HOA handbook be reviewed and approved by majority vote. She suggested a new neighborhood forum that didn't require moderator approval for every comment. And most importantly, she promised transparency. People didn't cheer like they had during Karen's dramatic speeches. They didn't erupt in wild applause or wave little flags. They just nodded, smiled, and stayed afterward to help put away chairs. That was the real shift. People were invested again, not scared. Karen, however, was unraveling. She hadn't left her house since the day of the election. The lights stayed off most nights. Her front lawn, once the most obsessively maintained on the block, now had patches of yellow grass. She hadn't sent out a single mass email in days, which for her was like going silent in another language. Word quietly spread that she'd tried to file a restraining order against Mariana, claiming psychological intimidation. The judge dismissed it after 3 minutes of review. Her name was slowly being scrubbed from HOA documents, not out of spite, but because no one wanted any more association with the disaster she had caused. National news outlets eventually moved on to the next outrageous headline, but the footage remained online. The internet never forgets, and Karen's face, mid-scream, surrounded by military vehicles and balloon arches, had been immortalized. Even late-night talk shows ran with the story. One skit featured an actress parodying Karen while being dragged off stage shouting, "I declare HOA law." A neighborhood kid with a knack for video editing even made a short animation of the incident, complete with dramatic music and a slow-motion shot of the unicorn getting crushed. It won him 3rd place in a digital art contest and a scholarship. What struck everyone the most wasn't just how Karen had fallen, but how much damage she had done on her way down. The financial audit revealed she'd diverted thousands of dollars from community funds into vanity projects, gold-painted mailbox samples, branded napkins for the gala, and a bizarre amount spent on noise-canceling hedge trimmers. She'd also been charging residents unofficial fees, funneling them through a now-defunct HOA event account that only she had access to. The legal fallout was still unfolding, but charges were expected. A quiet investigator from the state attorney's office had been seen meeting with the HOA board and later leaving with boxes of printed emails and copies of surveillance footage. In the middle of all this, life in Westbriar continued, tentatively optimistic. Mariana helped organize the first official community dinner in years. It wasn't fancy, just tables lined along the Central Park walkway with potluck dishes and string lights, but it felt special. People mingled, laughed, and shared stories not about fines or warnings, but about real things: family, jobs, memories. Captain Torres made an appearance too, though he stayed in the background, sipping sweet tea and pretending not to hear the jokes people made about him being the man who led a military operation against cupcakes and canopies. A group of teenagers tried to get him to autograph their Nerf guns. He politely declined. At one point during the dinner, someone made a toast, not to the downfall of Karen, but to the idea of community resilience. They raised their glasses to better days ahead, and everyone joined in. That moment was caught in a photo that later hung in the clubhouse, a new symbol for a new era. But just when everyone thought the storm had passed, the final twist arrived. One morning, a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. It was unexpected. No one had heard that she was selling her house, and given her stubbornness, no one thought she ever would. But there it was, a massive white truck with out-of-state plates, 2 movers hauling out furniture, boxes, and a frankly disturbing number of lawn ornaments. Karen appeared briefly, wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that could sour milk. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the stares of curious neighbors peeking out from behind curtains. She just barked instructions to the movers, loaded her miniature fountains, and disappeared into the house again. Rumors spread fast. Some said she had found a neighborhood in another state that hadn't yet caught wind of her reputation. Others believed she was going off the grid, launching some weird new HOA from a rented RV. One theory claimed she was writing a book, titled How to Govern a Neighborhood and Win. But the truth didn't really matter. What mattered was that by mid-afternoon, the truck pulled away, and for the first time since anyone could remember, Karen's house sat empty. A for sale sign went up 2 days later, installed not by her, but by the bank. Turns out, HOA leaders don't always pay their own dues on time. Mariana received a letter a week later. It had no return address but was unmistakably from Karen. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more like a rambling manifesto about betrayal, misunderstood genius, and how the neighborhood had never deserved her. Mariana read it once, folded it, and tucked it into her file cabinet, not because she needed a reminder, but because someday someone might need proof that the events really happened. That a woman had tried to block a military convoy with folding chairs and confidence. Months passed. The HOA became a functional, boring entity again, the kind of boring that residents actually appreciated. Meetings were short. Budgets were transparent. Disputes were resolved with logic instead of loudspeakers. The phrase "remember the gala" became neighborhood shorthand for bad ideas. Children were allowed to chalk on sidewalks again. A man reinstalled the wind chimes Karen once banned, and the sound of them in the breeze became a quiet kind of victory song. And somewhere far away, perhaps in another quiet neighborhood, another gate opened to reveal a woman with a clipboard, a blazer 2 sizes too bold, and a gleam in her eye. Maybe she had found her new stage. Or maybe, just maybe, she finally realized that ruling through fear only works until the people decide they've had enough. But back in Westbriar, the roads were open. The neighbors were talking. And the memory of one chaotic summer would never be forgotten, not because it broke them, but because it brought them together in the most unexpected way.